They killed the Envoy on a live diplomatic channel beneath the seal of interstellar law, while the entire Galactic Council watched in stunned silence and did nothing. Ambassador Elias Ward had gone to the Hall of Concord unarmed, wearing Earth's dark blue envoy coat with its silver threads at the cuffs and the small gold pin of Sol above his heart. He had gone because 3 human colony ships had vanished along the Perseus trade spine, because their distress beacons had cut out in Vaskaran patrol space, and because the Vaskaran Empire had answered every Terran demand for clarification with the same polished insult. No empire explained itself to a species that had barely clawed its way out of one star system a few centuries ago. Ward went anyway. He went with evidence, with law, with witnesses, and with a calm voice that never rose even when the chamber did. The Vaskaran High Legate let him finish speaking. That was the cruelest part. He let Ward lay out the sensor records, the broken registry codes from the colony ships, the thermal signatures of military boarding actions, the names of 2,000 civilians who had vanished into Imperial detention holds. He let the humans state, for the record, that the seizure of civilian vessels beyond declared war space was piracy under Council convention. He let him demand their release. Then the High Legate stood, adjusted the mantle of black metallic scales across his shoulders, and said almost lazily that humans still mistook admission to the Council for equality. He said Earth's envoy had insulted imperial sovereignty in open session. He said there were consequences for that, and before anyone understood what he meant, the honor guard behind the dais leveled a ceremonial disintegrator and burned Elias Ward to ash in the center of the floor. The chamber did not erupt. It froze. The ash swirled once in the sterile light and settled across the polished stone where a diplomat had been standing 1 second earlier. A few delegates recoiled. 1 or 2 shouted. Most just stared, because the murder had been committed with such absolute imperial confidence that disbelief reached them before outrage. The Vaskaran legate turned to the presiding council speaker and asked, as if requesting a minor procedural adjustment, that the records show the envoy had been lawfully executed for contempt. The speaker did not agree, but he did not order the guard seized either. The feed reached Earth 17 seconds later. Every human world saw the same thing: the ash on the floor, the silence after, the legate's expression, the speaker's failure. Children on Mars saw it in classrooms. Shipyard welders on Luna saw it between sparks. Deep-orbit tug crews saw it over static. Farmers under the domes of Ganymede saw it while irrigation pumps hummed in the dark. Nobody had to explain what it meant. A line had been crossed so completely that language could not soften it. And humanity did not answer with shouting. That terrified the first few people wise enough to understand it. There was no emergency address for nearly 3 hours. No threats, no speeches, no fleet footage, no outrage made theatrical for the cameras. There was only movement. Terran embassies across known space shuttered their windows in perfect sequence. Human delegates rose from committee tables without a word and left documents neatly stacked behind them. Merchant captains received encoded directives and altered course mid-voyage. Colony governors activated civil continuity protocols. Shipyards switched from mixed production to sealed military patterns. Every civilian traffic beacon entering Sol space transmitted the same 6-word notice in every council language. The borders of humanity are closed. At first, the galaxy laughed. The Kepri Combine mocked the declaration as a prey response. The Selenar clans called it grief theater. The Vaskaran Empire declared that Earth had retreated into its shell after learning what real power looked like. Commentators on neutral worlds smirked that humans, for all their talk of law and rights and civil protections, had folded the moment raw force entered the room. There were even jokes in the exchange markets that the border lockdown would last until the price of Terran luxury grain started hurting enough to bring them back to negotiations. They all missed the detail that mattered. Humanity had not closed its borders to keep danger out. Humanity had closed its borders to decide exactly what would never come back out. Within 6 hours, every jump lane entering Sol-adjacent volume encountered a field effect no one had seen before. Ships did not explode, they simply stopped making sense to their own drives. FTL wake geometry collapsed into harmless static. Navigation cores returned null vectors where stable transit corridors should have been. The lanes were still physically there, but the mathematics that made them traversable had changed. Human traffic slipped through on rotating encrypted harmonics. Everyone else hit a wall made of physics, code, and preparation so old it must have been built years in advance. That was when the Council stopped laughing. By the 12th hour, Terran assets had vanished from every vulnerable sector. Civilian transports reached secure anchorages, as if invisible hands had pulled them through the stars. Listening stations folded into stealth silence. Relay buoys went dark, then came back online, broadcasting only emergency navigational exclusions. At the edges of former trade routes, automated beacons marked new exclusion zones in cold, precise language. Unauthorized military entry into human-protected corridors would be treated as active hostilities. Distress traffic from neutral ships would be honored. Slaver traffic would not. The wording spread panic through exactly the people it was meant to. Because the Vaskaran Empire had not merely seized 3 colony ships, it had been taking people for years. Not openly, never with signatures traceable enough for censure. A freighter lost here, a survey team gone missing there, a colonial outpost that stopped transmitting after reporting unidentified inspection vessels in disputed systems. Most species saw the pattern and looked away, because the Vaskarans were old, wealthy, militarized, and useful. Their dreadnoughts kept pirates off the major lanes. Their tribute agreements lubricated commerce. Their diplomats were monsters, but predictable ones. And if some young species at the edge of expansion lost a few ships now and then, the Council's unspoken rule had always been simple. Survive long enough, and you get taken seriously. Humanity had survived plenty. It had just also been taking notes. 20 hours after Ward's execution, the 1st Vaskaran Border Squadron moved toward the Sol approaches, perhaps assuming a demonstration of force would break the mourning species before this became inconvenient. 11 cruisers, 4 destroyer screens, and the battle carrier Iron Verdict dropped from FTL in the Red Helix Transit Basin and found the approach beacons still blinking a polite warning in 6 languages. Turn back. Human defensive operations are active. The Vaskaran admiral transmitted an imperial demand for surrender. A human voice answered from nowhere visible and nowhere identifiable. It was calm, almost bored. "This is Fleet Command. You are ordered to power down weapons and prepare to be escorted from restricted space." The admiral laughed on an open channel. Then the first cruiser disappeared. Not exploded, not disabled, disappeared. One moment it occupied 3 kilometers of hard-edged imperial metal, radiant and armed. The next, it was simply absent, with a vacuum shock folding inward where its mass had been. The Vaskarans scattered formation too late. Something moved among them without emitting heat, light, or drive bloom. Sensor ghosts multiplied. 2 destroyers lost their engine sections, to cuts so clean their reactors took 6 full seconds to realize they were no longer attached to the rest of the hull. The battle carrier fired into empty void at targets that were always one update behind. Human commands continued to arrive in the same measured tone. Leave. The Iron Verdict launched strikecraft. None returned. The squadron turned to withdraw, and that was when the real lesson began. Every lane vector they tried had shifted. Transit anchors reported unstable geometry. Exit solutions collapsed on calculation. They were trapped in normal space. Inside a basin the humans had effectively reshaped around them, while unseen ships cut them apart, one by one. When the wreckage drifted clear enough for long-range civilian telescopes to capture it, the galaxy saw the new Terran warship profile for the first time. Not sleek, not ceremonial. All armored spine and hidden surfaces, as if built by engineers who had stopped caring whether anyone found them beautiful. Black against black, swallowing range-finding light. The name later attached to the class was not official, because humans never confirmed it. The one cruise across the Council used was simple: border ships. The Council summoned an emergency session. For once, the Hall of Concord was too loud. Delegates shouted over one another, demanded restraint from both sides, condemned the Vaskaran execution in carefully measured terms, and insisted that escalation would destabilize the entire central spiral. The same governments that had shrugged at disappearing human civilians now discovered a deep, trembling devotion to peace. Earth sent no ambassador. Instead, it transmitted a single legal packet to every member state. All 612 pages cross-indexed and sourced. Attached were archived complaints that had gone unanswered, shipping losses previously classified as unresolved, and a chain of intelligence so comprehensive it made half the chamber realize with sudden horror that humans knew more about interstellar trafficking, covert tribute routes, illegal labor exchanges, and Black Fleet supply nodes than the Council's own enforcement bureaus. At the end of the packet sat one sentence from the Terran Assembly. With the murder of Envoy Elias Ward under Council seal, all diplomatic immunity protections between the Terran Union and the Vaskaran Empire are void. Recovery operations are now in progress. Recovery operations. That phrase spread faster than fear, because while governments debated language, humans had already moved. Vaskaran stations on the outer trade arteries began going silent. Not destroyed, taken. Dock cameras later recovered from the debris showed the same impossible pattern. Lights cut, communications collapse, then armored figures entering through maintenance vanes nobody thought large enough for assault teams. Human boarding doctrine was surgical. Reactor rooms secured, life support preserved, command decks isolated, slave pens opened, data cores ripped out intact. Anyone who fought died quickly. Anyone who dropped weapons was zip-bound and sorted for tribunal transport. The rescued civilians told the rest. There were humans in those pens, yes, but not only humans. There were Kepri labor clutches tagged as debt collateral, Selenar juveniles taken from raided pilgrim barges, thin-framed Dorun navigators with their neural crowns burned away, and species no one on the major worlds recognized at all. Entire vanished populations were turning up in Imperial black sites hidden behind customs walls and anti-piracy jurisdictions. The Vaskaran Empire, respected elder power of the Council, had built part of its wealth on industrial-scale disappearances, and the species it had publicly mocked as sentimental and soft had just started opening every locked door. Panic finally arrived in the proper places. Imperial governors demanded reinforcements. Merchant insurers suspended coverage in 3 sectors. Neutral fleets rerouted around human exclusion zones by such absurd margins that fuel markets buckled. Council observers stationed near Vaskaran logistics hubs began reporting terrifyingly consistent Terran timing. Depots were hit minutes before fresh convoys arrived. Smuggling caches were seized hours before pickups. Covert relay sites were jammed with cryptographic keys that should not have existed outside Imperial command. Someone in the human chain had mapped the Empire's bloodstream with intimate precision. The answer, when it came, made it worse. For 73 years, humanity had been the Council's favorite contractor for infrastructure no old power wanted to maintain. Relay calibration, trade lane harmonics, emergency beacon standards, translation middleware, customs automation, dry, boring systems work given to the industrious younger species with the reputation for technical obsessiveness and legal reliability. Humans had built redundancies nobody paid attention to, audited vulnerabilities nobody bothered to understand, and staffed stations in places emperors and counselors never visited because those places were beneath notice. The galaxy had mistaken service for dependence. It had mistaken patience for passivity. It had mistaken friendliness for lack of teeth. When people later asked when the Voskaran Empire truly lost the war, historians rarely pointed to the First Fleet defeat. They pointed to the moment the Empire learned that the species it had insulted had spent 3 generations quietly learning how everyone moved, traded, lied, fed their armies, hid their crimes, and kept their lights on. Then had locked the borders. The Voskaran Emperor answered with fury. Imperial reserve fleets surged from the core, a wall of metal vast enough to crack minor powers outright. He broadcast that Sol would be burned, Earth broken, Mars salted, and every surviving human sold across 10,000 worlds as an example. The statement was meant to restore fear. It did, but not among humans. On Earth, the assembly convened beneath the old blue flag and the newer stars of the Union. There were no applause breaks, no swelling rhetoric. The vote authorizing full wartime execution passed almost unanimously. The dissenting representatives did not argue for surrender. They argued only over how far reprisals should go. Then Grand Marshal Imani Sato addressed the Union for 4 minutes and changed the temperature of the entire galaxy. She did not shout. She did not insult the Empire. She did not even mention revenge until the end. She stated that Envoy Ward had entered the Council under law, and the Council had allowed law to be murdered with him. She stated that human civilians and countless non-human civilians had been trafficked under Imperial protection. She stated that the Union would retrieve the living, identify the dead, dismantle every system that enabled such crimes, and enforce navigation quarantines until the threat had ceased to exist. Then she looked directly into the camera and said, "We are not declaring war to prove our strength. We are applying consequences because you left us no lawful alternative." The clip was translated into hundreds of languages. What came next was not a war as the old powers understood war. There was no grand charge toward imperial capitals, no wasteful theater, no human admirals thundering about conquest. Terran strategy moved like a tightening wire. Border fleets severed key lanes and let the Empire's size become a weakness. Supply chains strangled first, then communications, then authority. Isolated garrisons began acting on outdated orders and walking into prepared kill boxes. Imperial task forces would arrive to defend shipyards already infiltrated, to rescue prisons already emptied, to secure routes that had already been mathematically erased from usable space. Human cyber divisions did not flood networks with flashy sabotage. They altered trust. Dock doors refused Imperial biometrics. Munitions inventories passed audits until magazines opened empty in battle. Navigation charts included corridors that led straight into mine halos seeded months earlier by drones parked as harmless maintenance hulks. Every failure by itself seemed explainable. Together, they felt supernatural. Imperial morale broke in layers. First came irritation, then disbelief. Then the ugly stage where officers started executing subordinates to reassert control. Then fear, when admirals realized their counterpart across the void always seemed to know which move they considered safe. Finally came regret, the pure kind, when the first Core Ward worlds saw refugee convoys from outer colonies bringing stories of dark human ships hovering beyond orbit, not bombarding cities, simply waiting until local authorities handed over traffickers, prison wardens, and anyone tied to the camps. Resist, and the war came to your sky. Comply, and the humans moved on. That was the part no one expected. Humanity was terrifying, yes, but not drunk on it. There were no massacres broadcast for deterrence, no planets glassed to soothe public rage. They kept records. They triaged civilians. They established corridors for food. They treated surrendered enemy wounded. And every act of restraint made the Empire look smaller. Every prison ship catalogued. Every child returned. Every set of remains identified and transmitted to families with formal condolence seals. Discipline became its own form of horror, because it proved this was not revenge unraveling into bloodlust. It was policy. The Council tried, late and trembling, to broker a ceasefire. Earth finally agreed to attend under one condition. The chamber floor would remain uncleaned. So they met again in the Hall of Concord, where a faint gray stain still marked the polished stone beneath the lights. This time, the hall was ringed by Terran Marines in black dress armor, visors open, rifles sealed to ceremonial lock, but very real. The Vaskaran delegation arrived diminished, shrunken by weeks of defeat and the arrest of half their supporting ministries. The High Legate who had ordered Ward's death was not among them. 3 days earlier, he had been extracted from a hidden fortress moon by a Terran boarding team that crossed vacuum in dead silence and cut through 17 meters of composite wall. He now sat in magnetic restraints aboard a tribunal ship, awaiting charges not only from humanity, but from 12 species whose missing citizens had been found in Imperial camps. The council speaker, older now by what looked like decades, invited the Terran representative to speak. Humanity did not send a diplomat. It sent Ward's deputy, Commander Lena Adebayo, still in naval black, with the Envoy pin mounted beside her service ribbons. She stood exactly where Elias Ward had stood. For a moment, nobody in the chamber breathed. Then she began reading names. Not speeches, names. The 3 colony ships first, every man, woman, and child taken from them. Then names from other seized vessels. Then names from species the Council had ignored because their votes were too few to matter. The roll continued for almost an hour, and with every name the chamber felt less like government and more like a graveyard finally forced to remember who it had buried. When she finished, Adebayo set the tablet down and looked toward the speaker. "You called us new," she said. "You called us emotional. You called us dangerous when we asked for law and monstrous when we enforced it ourselves. Hear this clearly. Humanity did not close its borders because we were afraid of the galaxy. Humanity closed its borders because the galaxy had become unsafe for the innocent." No one interrupted. She continued, voice flat and razor clean. The Terran Union demanded full dissolution of Vaskaran extrajudicial detention networks, reparations to all identified victim populations, the surrender of responsible command personnel, permanent independent inspection of major transit arteries, and recognition of a revised diplomatic covenant whose first article would be written in the memory of Elias Ward. Harm an envoy under seal, and every treaty protection shielding your state would end at once. No debate, no delay, no procedural refuge. The Kepri delegate, whose own broodlings had been recovered from an imperial labor ship, rose first in support. Then the Selenar. Then worlds that had spent a century currying favor with the Empire discovered they had always hated bullying after all. One by one, vote by vote, the chamber turned. Not because humanity threatened to conquer it, though everyone knew by then that humans could have done far worse. The chamber turned because the truth had become too expensive to deny, and because, standing on that stained floor, the humans looked like the only adults left in the room. The Vaskaran Emperor refused the terms for 3 more days. On the 4th, Terran fleets translated into the outer shell of the Imperial home system in numbers the galaxy had not imagined humanity possessed. Not flashy battle lines, not triumphal formation, just layers upon layers of black warships holding perfect distance, their silhouettes blotting navigational stars from the observation decks of the core worlds. They did not fire. They did not advance. They transmitted a single encrypted package containing the registry of every prison site taken, every fleet lost, every official captured, every hidden account frozen, every route sealed, and every capital world now one order away from total economic isolation. Underneath it was a note signed by Grand Marshal Sato. "You are no longer negotiating from a position that exists." The surrender came before nightfall on the imperial capital. Afterward, the galaxy spent years trying to explain what humanity was. Some said predators with a moral code. Some said engineers who had weaponized patience. Some said librarians of violence, cataloging every insult until the shelf collapsed. The surviving Vaskaran commanders used simpler language in their tribunal testimony. They said humans had been calm right up until the moment calm became a decision. Elias Ward's remains, what little could be recovered from forensic sweepers in the Hall of Concord, were returned to Earth in a procession that halted shipping across 3 sectors. His name went into law. The stain in the council chamber was never removed. By unanimous vote, it was sealed beneath transparent crystal and left visible to every delegation that entered after, a permanent mark at the center of galactic politics, where arrogance had once mistaken restraint for weakness. Trade resumed slowly. Inspections became standard. Disappearances along the old lanes dropped to almost nothing. Terran border ships remained where they were, silent and watchful, and no one again tested whether the exclusions were warnings or promises. Alien children learned about Ward in school modules on diplomacy. Military academies across known space taught the border lock campaign as the clearest example of strategic overmatch ever inflicted by a supposedly inferior power. The phrase itself entered common speech in half the galaxy. Don't make them lock the borders. It meant, do not push disciplined people past the point where they stop talking. And perhaps that was the final lesson. Humanity had not asked to rule the stars. It had not charged out looking for kneeling species or tribute worlds. It had come into the galactic community with contracts, medical ships, engineers, farmers, judges, translators, and the ancient, reckless belief that laws were supposed to matter. Many found that charming. Some found it useful. The Vaskaran Empire found it contemptible, until the day it burned a human envoy alive and discovered too late that kindness backed by power is not fragility. It is a choice. And when humanity stopped choosing it, the galaxy finally understood what had been standing in front of it all along. They had executed Earth's envoy. Humanity answered by teaching the stars what a border was.